Your grandparents probably told you to save money. Put aside a little from every paycheck. Build an emergency fund. Don't spend everything you earn. It's advice that sounds prudent, responsible, even virtuous. And for most of human history it was. When money was gold or silver, saving it meant accumulating real wealth that would hold its value indefinitely. But something changed in the 20th century, something so fundamental that it reversed 5,000 years of monetary logic. Today, saving cash is guaranteed to make you poorer. Not might make you poorer if you're unlucky. Guaranteed. Mathematically certain. Every dollar you save in cash loses purchasing power every single day through inflation, a hidden tax that governments and central banks impose by expanding money supplies faster than economies grow. The numbers are brutal. At the Federal Reserve's target inflation rate of 2% annually, money loses half its value every 35 years. At the actual inflation rates Americans have experienced since 2020, often exceeding 5%, money loses half its value every 14 years. That means if you're 25 years old and you save $10,000 in cash today, by the time you're 65 and ready to retire, that money will buy what $2,500 buys today. You'll have lost 75% of your purchasing power not through spending, not through bad luck, but through the deliberate policy of central banks destroying the value of currency. Understanding the hidden cost of saving in cash means confronting an uncomfortable truth. The financial advice you were raised on is obsolete, possibly dangerous, and playing by the old rules of prudent saving can leave you impoverished, while others who understand the new rules build wealth by taking on debt, buying assets, and never holding cash longer than absolutely necessary. The story of why saving cash became a wealth-destroying strategy begins with the abandonment of the gold standard. For most of history, money represented a claim on something real, usually gold or silver. A gold coin contained gold. A dollar was defined as a specific weight of gold, and paper currency, when it existed, was a receipt you could exchange for metal held in a vault somewhere. This meant that saving money was saving real wealth. The gold didn't deteriorate, it didn't lose value spontaneously. And governments couldn't simply create more gold by printing it. The supply of monetary metals grew slowly, roughly in line with economic growth through mining. This kept inflation low or non-existent over long periods. Under the classical gold standard that prevailed from roughly 1870 to 1914, prices were remarkably stable. A basket of goods that cost $100 in 1870 cost about $100 in 1913. There were fluctuations, years of inflation and deflation, but over decades the purchasing power of money barely changed. This made saving straightforward and rewarding. If you saved $1,000 in 1870, that $1,000 bought the same amount in 1913. Your purchasing power was preserved automatically without any need to invest, take risks, or think about inflation. World War I shattered this system. Government suspended gold convertibility to print unlimited money for war finance. After the war, attempts to restore the gold standard failed because too much currency had been printed relative to gold reserves. The interwar period saw monetary chaos, hyperinflations in some countries, deflation in others, and economic instability that culminated in the Great Depression. After World War II, the Bretton Woods system established a modified gold standard where the US dollar was convertible to gold and other currencies were pegged to the dollar. But this too failed in 1971 when President Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility because the US had printed far more dollars than it had gold to back them. Since 1971, the entire world has operated on pure fiat currency systems where money has no backing except government decree and the confidence that others will accept it. This removed all constraints on money creation. Central banks can create money in unlimited quantities, and they have, expanding money supplies at rates far exceeding economic growth. The consequence is persistent inflation, the continuous erosion of currency purchasing power that makes saving cash a losing proposition. The mathematics of inflation's compounding effect are devastating. At 2% annual inflation, the rule of 72 tells us money loses half its value in 36 years. At 3% inflation, it's 24 years. At 5%, 14 years. And these calculations assume consistent moderate inflation. The reality is often worse, with periodic spikes that accelerate the destruction. From 2020 to 2023, US inflation exceeded 8% in some years, meaning cash held through that period lost 20 to 25% of purchasing power in just 3 years. Someone who saved $100,000 in early 2020 found it bought what $75,000 bought in 2023, a loss of $25,000 in real terms despite the nominal amount being unchanged. But official inflation statistics significantly understate the real loss of purchasing power for most people. The Consumer Price Index, the government's measure of inflation, is calculated using a basket of goods weighted according to average consumption patterns. But your consumption isn't average. If you're young and trying to buy a house, housing inflation matters far more to you than the CPI suggests. If you have children, education and childcare costs, which have inflated far faster than overall CPI, dominate your budget. If you're elderly and rely on healthcare, medical inflation destroys your savings faster than official statistics indicate. Housing provides the starkest example. The median U.S. home price was roughly $170,000 in 2000. By 2025, it exceeds $400,000, an increase of 135%. That's 3.5% annual inflation for housing, far exceeding the official CPI inflation rate of about 2.5% over the same period. Someone who saved cash from 2000 to 2025, thinking they were preserving wealth, found that housing, likely their largest eventual purchase, more than doubled in price while their savings barely grew if held in typical bank accounts paying minimal interest. The dream of saving for a down payment became a treadmill where the house price rose faster than savings could accumulate, making home ownership increasingly unattainable for cash savers. Education costs followed similar trajectories. College tuition increased roughly 180% from 2000 to 2025, far outpacing both wage growth and official inflation. Healthcare costs rose even faster. The basket of goods and services that matter most for middle-class life, housing, education, healthcare, inflated at rates double or triple the official CPI, meaning the hidden cost of saving cash was actually far worse than government statistics suggested. Bank savings accounts provide no refuge from this destruction. The average savings account in the U.S. pays about 0.4% annual interest as of 2025. With inflation running at 3-4%, the real return on savings accounts is negative 2.6% to 3.6% annually. You're guaranteed to lose purchasing power every year. High-yield savings accounts offer better rates, perhaps 4 or 5%, but even those barely keep pace with inflation and often trail it when inflation spikes. And those rates require actively shopping for the best accounts, moving money between institutions, and accepting various restrictions and limitations. Most people don't do this, leaving cash in checking or standard savings accounts earning essentially nothing while inflation destroys value. Certificates of deposit, once a staple of conservative saving strategies, haven't offered positive real returns in decades. CDs might pay 4 or 5% for locking up money for years, but inflation eats most or all of that nominal gain. And unlike stocks or real estate, CDs provide no possibility of appreciation beyond the stated interest rate. You lock in guaranteed real losses in exchange for principal safety that becomes meaningless when the principal buys less every year. The opportunity cost of holding cash extends beyond just inflation losses. Money in cash earns minimal returns while every other asset class generates income, appreciation, or both. Stocks have returned roughly 10% annually over the long term. Real estate in desirable areas has appreciated 6 to 8% annually. Even bonds, traditionally conservative investments, have historically returned 4-6%. Someone who kept $100,000 in cash from 1990 to 2025 would still have $100,000 nominally, worth perhaps $45,000 in 1990 purchasing power after inflation. That same $100,000 invested in an S&P 500 index fund would have grown to over $2 million, a 20-fold increase that far exceeded inflation. The opportunity cost of holding cash for 35 years was nearly $1.9 million in foregone wealth. This reality creates a cruel paradox. The people most likely to save in cash are those who can least afford the losses. The poor, the financially unsophisticated, and the risk-averse who've been taught that saving is virtuous and investing is gambling. Wealthy, financially sophisticated people understand that cash is trash. They hold minimal cash, just enough for immediate liquidity needs, and keep everything else in appreciating assets. Real estate, stocks, bonds, private equity, businesses, anything that generates returns or appreciates. Their wealth grows while inflation becomes someone else's problem. The poor and middle class, following traditional advice to save, accumulate cash in bank accounts and watch it melt away. A family that saves $500 per month for 10 years in a savings account will have accumulated $60,000. But inflation at 3% annually means that money buys what $44,000 would have bought when they started saving. They've lost $16,000 in purchasing power, a massive penalty for doing what they were told was responsible financial behavior. Meanwhile, a family that invested that same $500 monthly in index funds would have accumulated $82,000, assuming 7% returns after inflation, $38,000 more than the cash savers despite taking essentially the same action. The psychology of cash savings makes the losses even more painful. There's visceral satisfaction in watching a bank balance grow. Seeing $500 added every month, watching the number climb from $0 to $60,000 feels like progress and security. But it's an illusion. The number grows while the value shrinks. You're accumulating nominal dollars that represent declining real wealth. It's like climbing an escalator that's going down, expending effort, and feeling like you're ascending while actually losing ground. This illusion explains why governments and central banks love inflation. It's a hidden tax that people don't fully recognize or understand. If the government openly took 3% of your savings every year through explicit taxation, you'd revolt. But when inflation does the same thing invisibly, people often don't notice until years later when they realize their savings buy far less than expected. And even then, they tend to blame specific price increases, greedy businesses, or mysterious economic forces rather than recognizing that inflation is deliberate policy executed by central banks with government blessing. The Federal Reserve's 2% inflation target, established as policy in 2012 and embraced by most central banks globally, formalizes the guaranteed destruction of cash savings. The Fed explicitly commits to reducing the value of currency by 2% annually. This is presented as promoting economic stability and preventing deflation, but the real effect is transferring wealth from savers to borrowers and ensuring that holding cash is always a losing proposition. At 2% inflation, money loses half its value every 35 years, meaning anyone saving for decades-long goals like retirement is guaranteed massive purchasing power losses unless they invest in assets that appreciate faster than inflation. Defenders of moderate inflation argue that it encourages spending and investment rather than hoarding, which stimulates economic growth. If money loses value over time, people have incentives to spend or invest it rather than saving it, which increases economic activity. This sounds reasonable until you consider the distributional effects. Wealthy people don't hoard cash. They invest in assets that appreciate with or ahead of inflation. The people who do hold cash are those who can't afford the risks or complexity of investing. The poor, the elderly on fixed incomes, the financially unsophisticated. Inflation policy thus amounts to a transfer from the most vulnerable to asset owners, from the poor who hold cash to the rich who hold stocks and real estate. The elderly are particularly victimized by this system. Someone who worked 40 years, saved diligently, and retired with $500,000 in bank savings, thinking it would support them through retirement watches that money lose purchasing power every year. At 3% inflation, their $500,000 buys what $370,000 bought after 10 years of retirement. Their standard of living declines steadily despite having done everything right according to traditional financial wisdom. They trusted that saving was responsible, that accumulating money in safe bank accounts was prudent, and they were betrayed by monetary policy that systematically destroys the value of those savings. Retirees on fixed incomes face similar devastation. Social Security benefits are adjusted for inflation, but those adjustments lag reality and use CPI calculations that understate real cost increases for elderly people whose spending concentrates in healthcare and housing, categories that inflate faster than average. A pension of $3,000 monthly in 2000 still pays $3,000 monthly in 2025, but buys perhaps $1,300 in 2000 purchasing power. Retirees who assumed their pensions would provide stable income find themselves impoverished, not because the nominal payment changed, but because every dollar buys less every year. The damage extends to insurance policies with fixed payouts. Whole life insurance policies that mature after decades often pay benefits worth a fraction of what they'd have bought when purchased. A $250,000 life insurance policy bought in 1990 pays $250,000 in 2025, but that money buys what $112,000 bought in 1990. The insured saved and paid premiums for 35 years thinking they were providing substantial financial protection for their families, but inflation reduced the real benefit by more than half. The insurance industry profits from this arrangement, collecting premiums in today's dollars and paying claims in future depreciated dollars. Bonds present similar problems. A 30-year Treasury bond purchased in 1995 at 6% interest seemed like a conservative investment offering stable income. but inflation averaged about 2.5% over those 30 years, reducing the real return to 3.15%. And that calculation assumes reinvesting interest at similar rates, which became impossible when rates fell to near zero in the 2010s. The bondholder who thought they were securing 6% returns actually earned far less after inflation, and the principal returned in 2025 bought only 52% of what it bought in 1995. Bonds marketed as safe and conservative destroyed purchasing power almost as effectively as holding cash. The housing market demonstrates how inflation rewards borrowers and punishes savers. Someone who bought a house in 2000 with a $200,000 mortgage at 6% interest has been paying that mortgage with dollars that lose value every year. By 2025, they still owe whatever remains of the original $200,000 principal, but those dollars are worth far less than in 2000. The real burden of the debt has declined even as they've been paying it down. Meanwhile, the house appreciated from perhaps $250,000 to $600,000, creating massive real wealth. The borrower who took on debt and bought an asset won. The saver who held cash lost. This dynamic has taught a generation of financially sophisticated people to avoid saving cash and to embrace debt as a wealth-building tool. Borrowing at low nominal rates to buy appreciating assets when inflation runs higher than the interest rate is effectively free money. You're borrowing dollars that will be worth less when you repay them and buying assets that appreciate in nominal terms with inflation. The strategy has worked spectacularly for those who understood it early, creating massive wealth transfers from savers to leveraged investors. But this strategy depends on inflation remaining moderate and controlled. If inflation spirals out of control, as it has in numerous countries throughout history, debts become unpayable as interest rates spike, assets crash in real terms, and the economy collapses. The gamble that central banks can maintain 2 to 3% inflation forever, never allowing it to spiral upward or collapse into deflation, is a gamble many people are taking without fully understanding the risks. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and Argentina provide cautionary examples of what happens when inflation becomes hyperinflation. Cash savings are destroyed completely, often within months or even weeks. Someone with a life savings of $100,000 equivalent in local currency can find it worth $10,000, then $1,000, then $100 as inflation spirals. The pattern is consistent. Governments that print money excessively because they can't or won't raise taxes eventually destroy their currencies completely. Those holding cash are wiped out. Those who converted to dollars, gold, or foreign assets preserve some wealth. And the poor, who often have no option but to hold local currency because they lack access to alternatives, are devastated. While hyperinflation seems unlikely in the United States or other developed economies with independent central banks, the mechanics that cause it exist. Governments face enormous and growing debts. Political pressure resists the tax increases or spending cuts needed to address those debts. And the easiest solution is always to print money, creating inflation that reduces the real burden of government debt while destroying the value of private savings. Every government throughout history facing fiscal crisis has been tempted by this solution, and many have succumbed. The belief that modern central banks will resist this temptation indefinitely requires faith that hasn't always been warranted by history. The alternative to saving cash is investing in assets, but this requires financial literacy, access to investment accounts, and risk tolerance that many people lack or haven't developed. The stock market is intimidating to those who don't understand it. Real estate requires substantial capital and knowledge. Bonds and commodities require even more sophistication, and all investment carries risk of loss that cash doesn't face, at least not nominally. Someone who loses 20% in a stock market crash sees their account balance decline immediately and viscerally. Someone who loses 20% to inflation over time sees their account balance stay the same while purchasing power declines invisibly. This asymmetry in psychological impact makes cash feel safer than investment even when the mathematics prove it isn't. The nominal stability of cash balances provides emotional comfort that actual inflation-adjusted returns don't. Behavioral economists call this money illusion. People focus on nominal amounts rather than real purchasing power. A bank balance that stays at $50,000 feels stable and safe even as that money buys less every year. An investment account that fluctuates between $45,000 and $55,000 while providing higher long-term real returns feels risky and volatile despite being economically superior. Financial education attempting to overcome this illusion faces enormous challenges. Teaching people that their savings are losing value despite growing in nominal terms requires them to accept counterintuitive concepts and abandon deeply ingrained beliefs about money and saving. Many people resist, preferring the comfortable illusion of safety to the uncomfortable reality of guaranteed real losses. The cash savings trap is particularly vicious for those living paycheck to paycheck without surplus for investment. If every dollar earned must be spent on immediate needs, there's no opportunity to build investment portfolios that could protect against inflation. The working poor forced to hold small cash balances for emergencies face the highest inflation burden relative to wealth. A $2,000 emergency fund loses $60 per year to 3% inflation, which might not sound like much, but represents 3% of limited savings that person can't afford to lose. Meanwhile, a wealthy person's $2 million portfolio growing at 7% gains $140,000 annually, more than triple the inflation rate, concentrating wealth further. The policy solutions to protect cash savers are politically difficult. Returning to a gold standard would eliminate inflation, but would also prevent governments from using monetary expansion to finance spending or respond to crises. Most economists and policymakers consider this trade-off unacceptable. Raising interest rates enough to compensate savers for inflation would crash asset markets and cause recession. Indexing bank accounts to inflation would transfer inflation costs to banks, which would pass them to borrowers through higher loan rates, possibly causing credit contraction. The most realistic protection for individual savers is education and action. Understanding that cash is a rapidly depreciating asset that should be held only for immediate liquidity needs, learning to invest in appreciating assets even when uncomfortable, and accepting that the old model of prudent cash saving no longer works in a fiat currency system designed to inflate perpetually. For emergency funds, the traditional advice to hold 3 to 6 months of expenses in cash remains sound despite inflation losses. The liquidity and access that cash provides during emergencies outweighs inflation costs over the relatively short holding period. But beyond emergency funds, continuing to accumulate cash is financial self-sabotage. Every dollar saved in cash beyond immediate needs is a dollar guaranteed to lose purchasing power, a dollar that could be working to generate returns but instead sits idle depreciating. The hidden cost of saving in cash isn't just the inflation that destroys value. It's the opportunity cost of foregone investment returns, the psychological comfort of watching balances grow while real wealth shrinks, the regressive transfer of wealth from unsophisticated savers to sophisticated investors, and the fundamental betrayal of the social contract that said saving was virtuous and would be rewarded. In a fiat currency system with central banks committed to perpetual inflation, that contract is void. Saving in cash is no longer virtuous. It's economically irrational, guaranteed to impoverish savers relative to borrowers and investors who understand the new rules. Understanding this reality is painful, especially for older generations raised to believe that thrift and saving were paths to security. But reality doesn't change because we find it uncomfortable. The hidden cost of saving in cash is that you'll be poor, not because you didn't save, not because you were irresponsible, but because you played by rules that were changed without anyone clearly explaining what happened or why. The system rewrites the rules to favor those closest to money creation, those who borrow to buy assets rather than save to preserve wealth, those who understand that inflation is policy, not accident. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History doesn't repeat, but inflation never stops. And every day you hold cash beyond what you need for immediate expenses, you're paying a hidden tax that compounds silently, invisibly, inevitably. The cost of saving in cash isn't hidden anymore. It's right there in every price increase, every paycheck that buys less than it did last year, every retirement that falls short because decades of diligent saving couldn't outrun inflation's relentless destruction. Your grandparents' advice to save was right when money was real. It's a path to poverty now that money is just paper and promises backed by nothing, issued by governments drowning in debt and guaranteed to lose value forever at rates your rulers openly announce. Save if you want. But understand what you're really doing is losing slowly, virtuously, exactly as intended by the monetary system that turned your most responsible financial behavior into the surest way to stay poor.